Now for the period that most people think of without realising when they think of dinosaurs. Now, I'm sure a lot of people outside of the Allosaurus and Stegosaurus fan clubs wanted to throw things at me when I haven't mentioned their favourite dinosaurs just yet. The reason for that is because I've been covering the Jurassic, and most of the famous dinosaurs that people normally think of are actually from the Cretaceous, which is what I'm now covering in great detail. So I'm not going to stand on ceremony here. Why don't we get into how we first discovered the Cretaceous? All the way back in 1882, a Belgian geologist named Jean d'Amalius de Halloy came across strata within the Paris Basin, one of 5 geological regions of France. This particular strata had extensive chalk beds in it, so was named terrain Cretaceous, with the word Creta meaning chalk, hence Cretaceous meaning chalk bearing. By the mid-1800s, the Cretaceous had been further divided into 12 stages across the early and late Cretaceous. Now, the end of the Cretaceous is famously defined, but I'll get more into that when I get to the end of the period. The beginning of the Cretaceous, however, is probably the least defined boundary in all of geological history. Periods are normally bookended by major faunal changes across the globe, more often than not caused by an extinction event. The end of the Jurassic, however, saw some quite big faunal changeovers that were happening at various points rather than one big event. Where the Jurassic ends and the Cretaceous begins is pretty blurry. Generally, we say that the Cretaceous began around 145 million years ago though. When we last left off in the Jurassic, the supercontinent of Pangaea was no more. North America had now fully broken away from Gondwana and Eurasia, becoming an isolated landmass. The Atlantic Sea had already begun to open and grew in size as the Cretaceous continued. Moving further southeast, everyone's favourite landmass power couple finally parted ways as South America moved away from Africa, marking the end of Gondwana and creating the South Atlantic Ocean. Going even further southeast, we see something hugely important happen with regards to feeding everyone's terror of the land down under, as a piece of Antarctica broke away and drifted northeast. Australia had now formed and remained completely isolated until today. Now, when a landmass is cut off from the rest of the world, especially somewhere with such a unique climate, the heterogenisation of that landmass, especially with the life on it, reaches astounding heights. In other words, life there does its own thing without influence, explaining why the life that has evolved there is cute/horrifying, and why Aussies seem to have some alarmingly unhealthy views on what counts as dangerous. I love you guys, but you're bloody mental. Moving on up now, we see that Eurasia goes through the least amount of change with regards to landmass movement. But like the rest of the world during the Cretaceous, it was subject to lots of fluctuating sea levels. The rifting that was pushing certain landmasses into Eurasia, creating the Indian Ocean, created huge mountain belts under much of the sea, meaning that a lot of water was displaced and in turn raising sea levels. This meant that most of Europe and Asia was covered and divided with warm, shallow seas, along with parts of Africa, South America, and the most famous example being the Western Interior Seaway, a warm, shallow sea that ran all the way through the middle of North America. Now, it's this process of heightened sea levels and circulation of shallow oceans throughout the landmasses that gave the Cretaceous its namesake. Spare calcium saturated the seas that circulated around and were being readily used by the calcareous plankton, which, once fossilised and deposited, formed calcareous chalk. Since chalk is so fine, it can fossilise things with exceptional detail, and its widespread nature means that exposure of Cretaceous rocks have become famous in their respective countries, such as various formations in the US, Yixian Formation of China, and the Weald of the UK. And don't worry, I will get into all of those soon enough. So hopefully you know by now that with changing geography comes changing climate. Generally speaking, the Cretaceous went through 3 climatological phases: a warm dry phase, a warm wet phase, and then a cool dry phase. The Cretaceous kicked off with continuing the cooling trend of the end Jurassic, but things soon started to warm up again thanks to a series of volcanic events throughout the globe increasing greenhouse gases. As the many interior seaways grew and the climate continued to warm, the Cretaceous entered the warm wet phase. The spreading of water onto the land masses along with increased temperatures meant that humidity increased massively, especially in the tropics. Now, this is why many paleo environments at this time are comparable to more equatorial, swampy and tropical regions of today. The cool dry phase began as the CO2 levels began to drop again and would continue into the next period, which wouldn't be helped by a certain rock that decided to drop by. Again, I'll explain why in a minute. So what was life like on Earth at this time? Well, it's time we finally sunk our teeth into the forms of life that are the most famous from prehistoric times. But first, if you are enjoying this channel and support the level of education that I'm hoping to achieve here, be sure to leave a like and consider subscribing. Also, if you feel like you could do with more Dino-gen goodies, check out the Patreon link down below where you can find out how to access this channel's outtakes, behind the scenes content, voting power, merchandise, access to a Discord server, and so much more. Now that cheeky plugin is done, let's talk about life. And when it comes to the top providers of any trophic system, the plants, they had been much the same up until this point, with gymnosperms such as cycads and conifers dominating terrestrial landscapes. But they decided to change things up a little bit. During the early Cretaceous, we see the first occurrence of a group that would eventually make up 90% of plants today, which diversified astoundingly rapidly by using the very animals that were eating them to spread their seed. We now had the first angiosperms, more commonly referred to as the flower and fruit plants. Along with this, we see the humble beginnings of a weird thing called grass, though this group didn't become widespread until the end of the Cretaceous. Now for the animals, so let's jump back into the sea. Down here we see the usual groups with regards to the invertebrates, though types within those groups change slightly from the Jurassic. These include the echinoderms, various crustaceans, gastropods, bivalves, corals, and of course, ammonites. Many vertebrate groups in the sea had now begun to heavily resemble those alive today. Chondrichthyes had diversified mainly into rays and modern sharks. Teleos became the most common group of ray-finned fish, and turtles had diversified throughout the globe, looking very close to modern species with certain groups, but also grown to gigantic sizes, with examples like the famous Archelon, the biggest turtle to ever live. But the ocean also had some unfamiliar faces as well. Ichthyosaurs and plesiosaurs were still around, though not as extensively. Ichthyosaurs didn't actually see the end of the Cretaceous as they were already extinct halfway through, and plesiosaurs got a very formidable challenger during the late Cretaceous. You see, another group of reptiles decided to return to the sea, becoming much larger and more robust. Belonging to the same group as lizards and snakes, the squamates, these were the mosasaurs. Mosasaurs, despite being heavily associated with the Mesozoic, weren't actually around for that long, but their impact was astounding for such a short amount of time. Of all marine animals, these are scientifically the most accurate to the term sea serpents. They were air-breathing much like today's marine mammals and extraordinarily powerful tail swimmers, fighting their way to the top of their trophic systems as apex predators and filling a diverse number of niches in the warm, shallow seas. These whale-like reptiles ranged in size too, with the smallest being just under a metre, or around 3 feet, and the largest being Mosasaurus at 17 metres or 56 feet long. They also ranged in their prey items, from hardshell specialists to those that hunted the bigger vertebrate game. These guys became so widespread that the most common vertebrate tooth found from the Cretaceous rocks are actually mosasaur teeth. These guys are awesome and are probably my favourite marine prehistoric group, so I will be doing a video on those soon. Moving on, we have the amphibians, which more or less resemble the groups that are around today, with the odd outlier like the giant Beelzebufo, and then we also have the Charistodera. These guys were also swimming reptiles, but were semi-aquatic and freshwater, as well as being very crocodile-like, hitting their peak during the Cretaceous. Speaking of crocodiles, the Cretaceous was also a high point for them. Now, I've mentioned the crocodile group many times before, but I've meant the term very broadly, mostly referring to the clade Pseudotsuchia, of which most members I've mentioned have been crocodilomorphs. All of these groups are now extinct, with the only exception being crocodilia, which includes caimans, alligators, and true crocodiles. Despite the crocodilomorphs that showed their resilience over the ages, true crocodilians didn't actually appear until the late Cretaceous. So there's another group that surprisingly wasn't around for all that long during the Cretaceous. This is where we see the real big boys, such as Deinosuchus from North America and Sarcosuchus from Africa, two of the biggest crocodiles to ever live. If we go more securely onto land, we see that the invertebrates have been chugging along as they always had, with a few new groups popping up and diversifying, such as ants, termites, grasshoppers and wasps. The mammals were still the quote-unquote underdogs, but were most definitely an integral part of most terrestrial ecosystems around the globe. And they also occupied a surprising amount of niches as they had in the Jurassic, with carnivores, herbivores, aquatic foragers, and even some ballsy fellas that snacked on small dinosaurs. We also see the rise of therian mammals, which is what most mammals fall under today. But whether incorrectly or not, the Mesozoic is known as the time of reptiles, and certain groups hit their peak during the Cretaceous in terms of evolution, ecology, and pop culture. You know the ones I'm talking about. Archosaurs specifically ruled this world. They were everywhere, occupying every niche, took every shape imaginable and beyond, and ranged from the size of just 15 inches all the way to 120 feet long. They flew, they stomped, they bit, they rammed. They were doing pretty much everything that we can think of, along with things that likely aren't even seen today. And if you ever looked up to the skies during the Cretaceous, odds are you would have seen small birds or a range of pterosaurs. This would include the most famous, Pteranodon, as well as Tapiraromorphs, maybe the pelican-looking Istiodactylus, and if you're lucky, or unlucky, a giant Ajdarchid, such as the biggest animals to ever fly, Quetzalcoatlus. And if you can wrench your eyes away from the sky, odds are you'll see a dinosaur. But these things were so incredibly diverse that it really does depend heavily on where you are in the world as to what group you'll see. Standing in Europe, a common sight would have been the various species of the newly diversified ornithopods, including Ademonosaurus, Beryllium, Mantellosaurus, and Iguanodon, along with modest-sized sauropods like Ampelosaurus, Europatitan, and Aragosaurus. There are also a few Thoriophorians like Acanthophilus, Europelta, and a couple of stegosaur stragglers like Dacentrurus. Theropods present on these large islands were some dromaeosaurs such as the awesomely named Pyroraptor and Vectoraptor, Carcharodontosaurids like Neovenator, Concavenator, and Lusovenator, as well as just so many Spinosaurids like Baryonyx, Ceratoseucops, Camaryllosaurus, and Protathlitis. Moving over to Asia, you had more sauropods along with plenty of ornithopods like Gallimimus and the huge Dinochirus, plenty of Oviraptorosaurids, Therizinosaurs, Mononychids including the smallest non-avian dinosaur that we know of, Parvicursor, huge hadrosaurs like Shantungosaurus, countless dromaeosaurs like Achillobata, Dualong, Itomirus, Linhairaptor, and of course the famous Velociraptor. Speaking of these guys in particular, we also have plenty of Paraves theropods, which are the cousins in between dromaeosaurs and birds, many of which we know the colour of, which you can find out more about here. Other groups mentioned in that video is the famous Sinosauropteryx. There are huge numbers of Troodontids, even more ankylosaurs and smaller hadrosaurs, and we also see plenty of basal ceratopsians, such as Stegosaurus and Archaeoceratops. You also had bat-like dinosaurs like Yichi, and quite a few tyrannosaurs like Tarbosaurus, Eutyrannus, Guanlong, and Dilong. Okay, Asia is a big place. Now there is a lot that I've skipped over, or else I'll be here filming for days, but don't worry, I am going to be coming back over a lot of this in the next few weeks. If we cut across to Africa, we don't have quite as many Cretaceous rocks with dinosaur bones in, but from what we can tell, we have a few sauropods that stay behind after much of the group migrated outwards during the Jurassic, like the infamously named Nigersaurus, Egyptosaurus, and Paralotitan, a few hadrosaurs, and some pretty big name theropods, like a couple of Abelisaurids, Carcharodontosaurus, Suchomimus, and of course, Spinosaurus. Moving laterally, we come to South America, which seems to have the monopoly on the biggest dinosaurs, with Argentina being the best place for this. You had various theropods ranging from the huge Giganotosaurus, which I talk more about here, and Tyrannotitan, to more dainty fellows like Boeotiraptor. as well as being the most famous continent for abelisaurids like the famous Carnotaurus. South America was also the best place for a safari trip if sauropods were your cup of tea. You had quote-unquote regular-sized sauropods like Petrobrosaurus, Nullotitan and Mendozasaurus, and then you had the best of the best titanosaurs, such as the two contenders for the biggest land animal of all time, Patagotitan and Argentinosaurus. Then we can head north to have a gander at all those free dinosaurs. So remember how I said that the US was split by a shallow sea? Well, the Western Interior Seaway meant that North America was actually two countries. The wide and broad Appalachia to the east, and the long and thin Laramidia to the west. Appalachia's dinosaur fauna was less derived and more quote-unquote standard, with theropods like Acrocanthosaurus, Appalachiosaurus, Dryptosaurus, along with some indeterminate dromaeosaur teeth, ornithomimosaurs like Archosaurus, and Troodontids. The most abundant dinosaur group by far on this side of America were the hadrosaurs. So much so that this is considered the ancestral home of the group, being where they spread out to other continents from, with examples like Hypsibema, Protohadrus, and Hadrosaurus, funnily enough. If you dared cross that interior seaway, you'd look up and find plenty of fish and pterosaurs, such as the famous Pteranodon. But that's if, of course, you could outmaneuver the many plesiosaurs, sharks, and mosasaurs patrolling the waters. Once you reach the western shoreline, you'd be in Laramidia, which is Hell Creek country, baby. Now, despite being the most famous formation, like, ever, you may not have heard of it, but you have definitely heard of what lived there. You had Dakotaraptor, Edmontosaurus, Quetzalcoatlus, Ankylosaurus, Pachycephalosaurus, Triceratops, and Tyrannosaurus rex. Now, in the last few minutes, I've really skimmed over just the surface of what was there. So again, in the coming weeks, I'll be going into what was there in a lot more detail. In short, things were going great for these guys, but, you know, shit happens. 66 million years ago, the world was quite literally rocked when an infamous asteroid crash-landed into Earth in the Gulf of Mexico. This asteroid had a diameter of around 6 kilometers or 6.2 miles. And also, I just found out, falls across your screen when you Google Chicxulub crater. The Chicxulub crater, by the way, is the impact site that has given us all of the evidence for this impact. So, unlike all other extinction events, we're pretty certain of the cause. But how did this kill so much? Was everything vaporized in a day? Did the heat and debris break down life over a week? Well, it actually probably took place over the course of years. Yes, the non-avian dinosaurs were alive for quite a few years after the impact. As to how many years, well, it's difficult to say for certain from evidence, since leftover taxa are found after the KPG boundary that should only exist before it. But this doesn't often tell us how it died, let alone exactly when, beyond a couple of million years estimate. There's also the question of what didn't fossilise. Preservational bias is an issue that paleontologists run into with almost every single research project that they carry out. It's basically the question of if something has or hasn't fossilised, how do we know whether or not it reflects how things actually were, or if things were present that just didn't get preserved. Maybe a lot of dinosaurs and pterosaurs took longer to die off globally than we think, but their rarity meant that they just didn't fossilise. But if we take the logical approach to the effects that this kind of impact would have had, then we can estimate. First off, what about the naysayers? Of course, as with anything in geology, there are those out there that disagree with this theory. Many have argued that the non-avian dinosaurs were declining anyway, and the asteroid just finished them off, whereas others think that the asteroid had nothing to do with it altogether. One of the alternative theories put forward about what killed the dinosaurs is on a similar vein to what is thought to have caused the Permian mass extinction. In west central India is a layer of rock around 2,000 meters thick, which is a flood basalt known as the Deccan Traps. This meant that over the course of around 800,000 years, constant volcanic eruptions were spewing out lava over an area of approximately 500,000 square kilometers or 200,000 square miles. Those 800,000 years happen to have crossed over the KPG boundary, meaning that certain scientists theorise that such a high amount of carbon being released into the atmosphere could have caused the extinction. The creation of the traps certainly wouldn't have helped the conditions. However, certain geophysical models have shown that these eruptions were actually caused by the asteroid impact. Now, if the Permian mass extinction is anything to go by, the effects only seem superficially similar, as marine life would feel these effects much more. There's no doubt that the creation of the traps actually happened and that it would have had some consequences, but it seems doubtful from the evidence that this was anything more than a contributing factor. A reduction in sea levels have also been attributed to much of the extinction, since most of the marine organisms that died off inhabited shallower waters, and sea level reduction can be seen in the rock record. Of course, this wouldn't have affected life on land as much, so wouldn't offer a whole picture. While some geologists have theorised that this was thanks to inactive mid-ocean ridges sinking under their own weight, there appears to be no definitive explanation as to why this is. It couldn't have been growing ice caps, since ice caps weren't even around at the time, and even if they were, this would need to be caused by a drop in global temperature, which would have been caused by, say, an impact winter? Whichever way you cut it, it seems this was just another contributing factor to an already dire situation. So the asteroid hits. What next? Well, first up, everything within 50 to 100 miles of the crash site would have been vaporised almost instantly, with this impact expelling the same energy as several million nuclear bombs detonating simultaneously. After that, you then had the resultant shockwaves. High winds would have wreaked havoc across the Americas, and tsunamis would have hit almost every shoreline across the globe, with animals that inhabited places like Hell Creek being flooded within hours of the impact. Then there are the shockwaves that go underneath the planet's surface. Earthquakes reverberated around the world, and magmatic chambers and plumes would have been shaken up, resulting in eruptions. The one after effect that truly doomed the entire planet, though, was the dust. If you throw a stone into sand, you'll notice that all of the surrounding sand is thrown up into the air briefly. Well, at this magnitude, the debris was thrown so far and wide that it entered the stratosphere. From here, it circulated the globe. This kicked off what would be dubbed the impact winter for years to come. With this, the sun was blocked out and life on Earth was harshly reminded of how much we rely upon it. With the vaporization, this debris was joined by vaporized sulfuric fumes that would have caused continuous acid rain across the planet. This acid rain was very bad news for the marine organisms, throwing off the delicate chemical balance that marine life is so dependent on, and the lack of sunlight meant that plant life was in a bit of a pickle. In any trophic system, be it paleo or modern, plants are the base of this pyramid, being the first organic providers of energy. With them dying off, anything that eats the plant suddenly finds themselves in a state of starvation and then begin dying off as well. The only guys that thought they'd hit the jackpot at first were the carnivores. You were practically tripping over animal carcasses that were more abundant than the carnivores. No effort was required to hunt and kill them, and there was more than enough to go around, so less scrapping for the scraps. Obviously this couldn't last forever though, and the food ran out pretty quick for the carnivores too. Now that there is such a dramatic reduction in food, those big dinosaurs that thought they were the dog's bollocks didn't seem so hot with their massive bodies that required an inordinate amount of calories. On top of this, there have been some recent studies looking back into the extinction of the non-avian dinosaurs, in which scientists have found that there was likely more than one asteroid that struck Earth at this time. Discovered around 250 miles off the coast of West Africa, a crater named the Nadir crater was recently discovered that dates back to the same time as the Chicxulub crater and is approximately 5 miles across. Something that left a crater like this would have had similar effects to the impacts that I mentioned before, completely vaporizing anything within the immediate area and causing extraordinarily high magnitude earthquakes and tsunamis, potentially up to around 1,000 meters high. Now imagine a wave approaching from the sea that is high enough to graze the clouds. Now it was once again the small generalists that thrived. Smaller reptiles, mammals and birds weren't quite as fussy with their food requirements and were well adapted to a difficult underdog life. So were the only ones who were able to stick it out until things on planet Earth improved. All in all, roughly 75% of life on planet Earth was wiped out. Obviously this is bad and often cited by most as the extinction event. In reality though, it was just the most recent one, and life has bounced back from worse, as I've mentioned many times before. But its infamy will remain as the event that killed off the dinosaurs. Or did it? Say it with me now. Birds are dinosaurs. It's really easy to think that we're now in the time of mammalian dominance, since this group now occupies the apex niches in most ecosystems, even creating a new niche that hasn't been seen on this planet before. But what does dominance actually mean? Is it number of species? Is it lack of rivalry? Is it the diversity of morphology and niches occupied? Well, birds have all three of those in spades. So do dinosaurs still dominate to this day? Well, that is a question that I'll be answering next time.